The door slammed so hard the walls seemed to shake. It was March 3rd, Florida, 8:40 in the morning, and I remember the time because the coffee maker had just clicked off behind me. The smell of burnt grounds hung in the air while my son stood across the kitchen, his face red, his jaw tight, his hands balled like he was holding himself back. "Get out of my house," he said. Then, colder, sharper, "We don't need you anymore." I was still holding a piece of paper from the bank. My fingers had creased it without my noticing. $247,000. A loan taken out in my name. The signature at the bottom looked like mine. The curves were careful. Familiar. But I had never signed it. I looked at him, then at the paper, then back at the cabinets I had helped choose, the floor I had paid for, the house I thought was ours. In that moment, something settled in my chest with terrifying clarity. I wasn't just unwanted. I had been used. If you're wondering how a mother ends up here, holding a bank statement while her own child throws her out, stay with me. This is the story I never thought I'd have to tell. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 62 then, though the mirror made me look older, as if grief had added a few extra years the way salt stiffens cloth. For most of my life I was the person who kept the lights on, the fridge full, and the small quarrels from turning into storms. I worked payroll at a boat parts company outside Jacksonville for 27 years. Nothing glamorous, just steady numbers, steady hours, steady hands. I learned early that peace is built from ordinary things, paying the mortgage on time, clipping coupons, showing up when people are tired. My husband, Daniel, died on a Wednesday in October. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and wilted lilies. After the funeral, I went home and stood in our kitchen with his coffee mug still on the drying rack, and I understood the quiet truth: there was no one left to lean on but me. Ethan was 17 then, long-limbed and impatient, always half a step from the door. He didn't mean to be cruel. He was simply young, and young people believe time is endless. I took extra shifts. I put his college deposit in a separate envelope marked D. I told myself I wasn't sacrificing, I was investing. That's what mothers do, I thought. We pour ourselves out and call it love. When Ethan grew up, he did what I had hoped: he found work, he moved out, he built a life. He married Brooke 3 years after college. She was pretty in a polished way, hair always smooth, nails always done, voice always light as if nothing had ever weighed on her. The first time I met her, she hugged me quickly and said, "Margaret, we're so grateful you raised him right." It sounded like a compliment, but it also sounded like a closing statement. At first I was proud of how much they leaned on me. Proud that my help still mattered. If Brooke called because they needed a sitter for a weekend trip, I rearranged my calendar. If Ethan mentioned a car repair, I slipped him $200 in a card, like it was nothing. I told myself it was better to give while I could, better to be needed than forgotten. But need can change its face. It can start as warmth and become expectation. Little things began to happen, so small I could have brushed them off if I wanted to. Brooke would say, "We'll just put it on your card and pay you back," and then weeks would pass. Ethan would joke, "Mom, you're basically our safety net," and laugh as if it were sweet. When I mentioned my own plans, maybe a cruise with the church ladies, maybe repainting my bedroom, he'd say, "Sure, Mom," in that distracted tone people use when they've already decided it won't happen. I didn't call it disrespect. I called it family. Still, I felt the shift. It was like standing near an open freezer in a grocery store, cold air you don't notice at first, until your fingers go numb. My pride stayed in place, but underneath it, something else grew, a thin, bitter thread of worry. Not because I thought they hated me, but because I sensed they were getting used to the idea that I would always say yes. And I had trained them to expect it. By the time Ethan told me they were moving to Florida for better opportunities, I heard the excitement in his voice and the calculation in Brooke's silence. I told myself not to be suspicious. I told myself to be a mother. I wish I had listened to the part of me that went quiet. I kept a yellow legal pad in my desk drawer where I wrote every bill: electric, water, insurance, groceries. The habit made me feel safe. Even after Ethan married, I still tracked my spending the way other women tracked recipes. I had saved $312,400 by the time I turned 60, not because I was rich, but because I was careful. Daniel used to say, "Margaret, you can't hug money," and I would answer, "No, but you can keep the heat on with it." Ethan and Brooke lived faster than I did. New phones, newer furniture, dinners out that ended in photos of glossy plates. They spoke in plans, next year, soon, once we refinance, as if the future were a room they could stroll into whenever they pleased. When I visited, Brooke would straighten cushions behind me while I was still sitting, like she couldn't bear the imprint of my presence. Ethan had developed the habit of finishing my sentences, smiling as if it were affection. One Thanksgiving I brought my old blue casserole dish, the one with a hairline crack I never minded. Brooke set it at the far end of the counter and said, "We're doing things a little differently this year." Her tone stayed polite, but the meaning was clear. I was a guest, not the center. I told myself this was normal. Families change shape. Mothers step back. Still, some nights I woke at 3 a.m. listening to the ceiling fan and thinking about the word security the way people think about weather, something you can't control, only prepare for. I didn't yet know how close I was to losing mine. I kept saying yes, and they heard forever. The first crack came after my stroke. It was mild, the doctors said, the kind people recover from if they listen and rest. I remember the hospital room being too bright, the TV murmuring to no one, and Ethan sitting at the foot of my bed scrolling his phone while Brooke stood near the window with her arms crossed. When the doctor left, she turned and smiled, quick and practiced, and said, "Florida will be good for you. The warmth, the sunshine. We'll take care of you." I wanted to believe that sentence. I wanted it so badly I didn't test it. I nodded, because nodding felt easier than asking what take care actually meant. Within weeks, everything moved quickly. Too quickly. My house, the one Daniel and I had lived in for over 30 years, went on the market. I packed my life into boxes labeled kitchen, bedroom, memories. The realtor talked about curb appeal while I stood in the hallway touching the wall where Ethan's height had been penciled in year by year. The day it sold, I sat alone at the dining table and signed the papers with a pen that kept slipping in my fingers. I closed my savings account and transferred the money the way Brooke suggested. "It'll be simpler," she said. "One clean place. One family home." Her voice was calm, reasonable, the way people sound when they're sure they're right. The new house in Florida was bigger than I needed and brighter than I liked. White tile floors, wide windows, a kitchen that echoed. Ethan said, "You'll love it once you're settled." Brooke added, "We'll finish the paperwork later, Mom. Now isn't the right moment." She said it while unpacking dishes, as if legal details were no more important than napkin rings. At the time, that sentence didn't alarm me. I had raised a son. I had trusted him with my heart, my time, my money. Trust felt like habit, not risk. But anxiety has a way of settling quietly. It sat with me in the evenings when the house grew still and I realized my name wasn't on the mailbox. It followed me when Brooke reorganized cabinets I had already arranged. It whispered when I asked simple questions and got vague answers. "Soon. Don't worry. We'll handle it." I told myself I was being sensitive because of the stroke. I told myself healing takes patience. Still, I started keeping copies of things. Bank statements folded into a blue folder. Emails printed and stacked neatly. I didn't know why, only that some instinct I'd ignored for years had begun to clear its throat. One afternoon, I asked Ethan when we would finish the paperwork. He didn't look up from his laptop. "Mom, why are you stressing?" "Everything's fine." Brooke smiled from across the room, but her eyes stayed sharp, measuring. That was when I understood the delay wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't kindness. It was strategy. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Fear, yes. But also the first stirrings of betrayal, still soft, still unbelievable. I pressed my palm flat against the mattress to steady myself. I told myself families don't do this to each other. I was wrong. Life in Florida settled into a pattern that looked peaceful from the outside. Sunlight poured through the windows every morning. Palm trees whispered beyond the fence. Neighbors waved. From the street, the house looked like a fresh start. From the inside, it felt like I was slowly being erased. At first, it was small. The coffee maker would already be empty when I came into the kitchen. Brooke would say, lightly, "Oh, we only made enough for two," as if it were an accident, as if I hadn't been standing right there the day before when she bought the machine with my card. I started keeping instant coffee in my room, heating water with the kettle I'd brought from my old house. My things began to move. A sweater I liked disappeared from the hall closet. A framed photo of Daniel vanished from the mantel and reappeared, weeks later, in a box in the garage. When I asked, Brooke said, "I'm just trying to declutter." You understand. I did understand. I understood that my presence was considered clutter. Conversations changed tone. When I entered a room, voices lowered or stopped. Ethan would clear his throat and say, "Anyway," and Brooke would pick up her phone. Decisions were made without me. Dinners planned. Trips discussed. I learned about them the way strangers do, by overhearing. Rules appeared without announcement. We usually eat at 6. We don't leave lights on in unused rooms. It's better if you let us know before having visitors. Each sentence was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a fence. I began to ask permission for things that used to be mine by right. Could I use the washing machine now, or were they running a load later? Was it okay if I watched my program in the living room? Brooke would smile and say yes, but her eyes would flick to the clock, reminding me that yes had limits. The strangest part was the gratitude they expected. If Ethan handed me groceries he'd picked up on his way home, he waited for thanks as if it were charity. If Brooke paid a bill from the account I'd funded, she announced it at dinner. "We took care of the electric today," she'd say, and Ethan would nod, proud. I learned to thank them for spending my own money. At night, I lay in bed listening to the house breathe. The refrigerator hummed. Pipes clicked. Somewhere down the hall, laughter rose and fell behind a closed door. I felt like a tenant without a lease, careful not to disturb. I reminded myself that I was healing. That strokes take time. That families adjust. Still, humiliation crept in, quiet and persistent. It showed up when Brooke corrected me in front of guests. When Ethan sighed if I asked too many questions. When I realized I no longer knew where important documents were kept. I kept my blue folder hidden beneath sweaters in my suitcase. Every few days, I added something to it. A bank notice. A receipt. An email Brooke had printed and left on the counter by mistake. I didn't confront them. I watched. Watching felt safer. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the microwave door. Smaller. Quieter. I barely recognized the woman staring back. I had paid for this house, but I lived in it like a guest who had stayed too long. That was when sadness tipped into humiliation. And humiliation, I learned, is not the end of something. It is the beginning of waking up. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just after 9. I remember because the sun was already hot, pressing through the windows, and Brooke had left a half-empty mug on the counter, a faint ring of coffee drying at the bottom. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. I had learned not to answer things that weren't meant for me. A polite woman introduced herself from the bank I had used for years. She thanked me for my recent application and said she was calling to confirm a few details before the funds were released. Her voice was calm, efficient, practiced. I asked her to repeat herself, certain I had misunderstood. "You applied for a loan against the property," she said. $247,000. I sat down slowly, the chair leg scraping the tile. I told her there must be a mistake. I hadn't applied for anything. There was a pause on the line, the soft clicking of keys. Then she said, "The application is complete. All signatures are in place." My mouth went dry. I asked when it had been submitted. She gave me a date from the week before, a timestamp down to the minute. I knew exactly where I had been then, sitting in the living room, folding laundry, listening to Ethan and Brooke talk in low voices at the kitchen island. She offered to email me the documents. When they arrived, I opened them with hands that felt borrowed. Page after page, my name appeared where it shouldn't have been. My address. My information. And at the end, a signature that mimicked mine so well it made my stomach turn. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. Something steadier took over. I went to my room and pulled out the blue folder. I laid everything on the bed. Bank statements. Copies of transfers. Emails about paperwork that never seemed to get finished. The picture they formed was clear enough that even denial couldn't blur it. The whispers made sense now. The tension. The way they watched me when money came up. The way Brooke's eyes followed my purse. The pressure disguised as care. I saw it not as confusion, but as preparation. When Ethan came home that afternoon, I asked him about the loan. I kept my voice even. He froze for half a second too long. Brooke stepped in immediately. "It's nothing," she said. "Just a temporary thing." We were going to explain. Explain what, I wondered. That they had used my name like a tool. That my trust had become collateral. Ethan's face hardened. "Why did the bank call you?" he asked, as if that were the real problem. That night, I barely slept. The ceiling fan clicked rhythmically, the same sound I'd listened to since moving in. Only now it felt like a countdown. By morning, fear had sharpened into awareness. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't being sensitive. I was standing inside a plan that had already moved forward without my consent. I folded the bank paper carefully and slipped it into my purse. I didn't know what would happen next. I only knew I was done pretending this was normal. By the time the kitchen door slammed a few days later, I was no longer surprised. I was ready to understand what they had done to me. That morning, the air in the kitchen felt tight, like it does before a storm breaks. I had the bank papers folded in my hand, the edges soft from being opened and closed too many times. Ethan stood across from me, shoulders squared, as if he had rehearsed this. Brooke leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her face already set. I said his name once. Just once. I asked him to explain. He didn't. Instead, his voice rose, sharp and unfamiliar. "You're dragging us down," he said. "Everything is falling apart because of you." I looked at him, searching for the boy who used to leave his shoes in the hallway, who once cried because he broke a neighbor's window and didn't know how to fix it. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who saw me as an obstacle. Brooke spoke next, calm but firm. "This isn't working anymore, Margaret. You're confused all the time. The bank calling, the questions. It's creating stress we don't need." I held up the paper. My hand shook, but my voice didn't. "You took out a loan in my name." Ethan slammed his palm on the table. "We did what we had to do." That was when the door slammed, hard enough to rattle the walls, as if the house itself flinched. The sound echoed through the room, final and violent. Ethan stepped closer, his face red, his breath fast. "Get out of my house," he said. "We don't need you anymore." The words landed heavier than the door ever could. I felt them in my chest, in my knees, in the quiet place where I had stored years of excuses for him. I looked down at the floor I had paid for, the cabinets I had chosen, the light fixture I had argued over because Brooke wanted something trendier. My house, he called it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Inside me, something went very still. Pain was there, yes, but it was wrapped in something else now, something colder. I understood then that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake made under pressure. It was a decision. A decision they had made together. Brooke looked away first. Ethan kept staring, waiting for me to break, to beg, to remind him of everything I had given. I didn't give him that. I turned and walked down the hallway to the room that had never quite been mine. I pulled my suitcase from the closet and opened it on the bed. My hands moved slowly, deliberately. Close folded. The blue folder slipped carefully into the side pocket. From the kitchen, I could hear them talking in low voices again, already discussing what came next, as if I were gone. With each item I packed, the truth settled deeper. This was not anger in the moment. This was removal. I had outlived my usefulness. When I closed the suitcase, the click of the zipper sounded louder than the door had. I stood there for a moment, hand resting on the handle, and felt something unexpected rise. Not despair. Clarity. For the first time in years, I stopped thinking like a mother whose job was to absorb the blow. I started thinking like a woman who had been wronged. And that changed everything. I carried the suitcase past the living room without looking at the photos on the wall. I knew if I looked, I might pause, and pausing was a luxury I could not afford. Ethan stayed in the kitchen. Brooke followed me only as far as the hallway, her footsteps light, her silence louder than any insult. At the front door I slipped my feet into my sandals. My hands moved carefully, as if I were doing someone else's routine. I felt the weight of my keys in my palm. There was a time those keys meant belonging. Now they felt like evidence. Ethan called out, "Leave the spare on the table." I didn't answer. I set it down exactly where he wanted, the metal making a small, final click against the wood. Then I opened the door and stepped into the Florida heat. The air smelled like cut grass and sunscreen from a neighbor's yard. A lawn sprinkler ticked back and forth, steady and indifferent. I walked to my car. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, paid off, registered in my name. When I sat behind the wheel, my hands shook for the first time that morning. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and listened to my own breathing until it slowed. In that quiet, the truth stopped circling and landed. They hadn't lashed out because they were frightened of the loan. They had lashed out because I had discovered it. The moment I held that bank paper, I stopped being useful. I became risk. I thought back to Brooke's voice, "We'll finish the paperwork later." To Ethan's distracted smile when he said I was their safety net. To the way my mail had begun arriving already opened. To the nights when conversations ended the second I entered the room. None of it was random. It was a gradual tightening, like hands closing around a jar lid, waiting for the right twist. I started the engine and pulled away without checking the house again. At the first red light, my phone buzzed. A text from Ethan, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Harder. As if my only role was to keep things easy for them. As if my dignity was an inconvenience. I drove to a grocery store parking lot because it was public and I needed somewhere to sit. I parked beneath a thin strip of shade and opened my purse. The bank documents were still there, folded like a secret. I smoothed them on my lap and read every line as if I were reading my own obituary. $247,000. My name. My signature. Their address. Their phone number listed as the preferred contact. It was all right there, plain as daylight. I felt a sting behind my eyes, but I refused to let it become tears. Tears belonged to the old me, the one who softened every edge, who apologized for existing. I didn't want that woman to leave me now. A thought came, simple and calm, if they could do this once, they could do it again. Another followed, if I went back, I would be agreeing to it. I sat up straighter and reached for the yellow legal pad I kept in my glove box. My handwriting was slightly uneven since the stroke, but it was still mine. I wrote down what I knew, line by line. Date of the call. Amount of the loan. The banker's name. The timestamp. The email address the documents came from. I wrote as if I were taking minutes in a meeting, because that was how I kept my mind steady. When I finished, I held the pen and looked out at the rows of cars. People pushed carts. A child laughed. Ordinary life kept moving, even while mine cracked open. I wasn't powerless. I had simply been treated as if I were. I took off my wedding ring and turned it between my fingers. Daniel was gone, but the band still reminded me I had once been chosen with care. Lately, I had been living in a house where my choices didn't matter. For years I had mistaken endurance for love. I believed that if I stayed gentle and useful, I could keep the family stitched together. But stitches only hold when both sides want the seam. Ethan and Brooke didn't want a seam. They wanted access. I opened my contacts and hovered over Ethan's name. My thumb wouldn't press. There was nothing to say that would fix this, because the damage wasn't an argument. It was a theft, and it needed my silence. So, I called the bank back and asked for the fraud department. The man on the line asked questions and I answered plainly. Did I authorize this? No. Did I sign? No. Did anyone have access to my information? Yes, I said, and my throat tightened because the anyone was my child. He placed a hold and opened a report. Then he gave me a reference number. I wrote it down carefully. Reference numbers are small things, but they are anchors. When I hung up, my hands were steadier. Not because I felt brave, but because I felt awake. I didn't know where I would sleep that night. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it clarified what mattered. I could be uncertain and still be in charge. And sitting there with papers on my lap, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not beg. I would not negotiate my worth. I would act. The lawyer's office was small and cool, tucked between a dry cleaner and a travel agency that advertised cruises I no longer wanted. The waiting room smelled faintly of lemon polish. I sat with my purse on my lap, fingers wrapped around the strap, reminding myself to breathe slowly, evenly, the way the therapist had taught me after the stroke. When my name was called, I stood without hesitation. That surprised me. The lawyer listened more than he spoke. He was a man in his late 40s with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose. I laid my documents on his desk in careful order. Bank statements first. Property records. Emails. The forged signature. I told the story without decoration, the way you tell facts when emotion would only blur them. He leaned back and steepled his fingers. Margaret, he said gently, the house is legally yours. Fully. Solely. He tapped the loan papers. And this is fraud. The word landed hard, but it didn't frighten me. It clarified. We moved quickly after that. He made copies. He filed notices. He contacted the bank's legal department. The fraud report became a case number, then a process. I signed revocation forms, freezing access to accounts Ethan and Brooke had been using freely. I changed passwords I hadn't touched in years. Each click of the pen felt like reclaiming a small piece of ground. I expected to feel guilty. I had been trained to feel guilty whenever I protected myself. Instead, I felt precise. Focused. Like a woman balancing her checkbook after a long absence. When Ethan found out, he called repeatedly. I let the phone ring. Brooke sent emails that swung between panic and politeness. This has gone too far. We can talk this out. Think about what this will do to the family. I printed them and added them to my folder. Words are evidence when patterns emerge. The lawyer explained what would happen next. Investigations. Interviews. Consequences. He didn't promise outcomes. He promised process. That was enough. I moved into a short-term rental near the beach. It was modest, furnished with white sheets and borrowed art, but it was quiet. At night I could hear the ocean, steady and indifferent, like something ancient that didn't take sides. I slept better than I had in months. Some mornings I woke with a heaviness in my chest, the ache of knowing my son had chosen this path. I let the feeling exist without feeding it. Then I made coffee. 4-1. Exactly the way I liked it. The house in Florida went back into my name entirely. The loan was voided. Official letters arrived in thick envelopes. I kept them stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, not as trophies, but as reminders that calm persistence can outweigh fury. People sometimes imagine strength as loud. They imagine slammed doors and shouted truths. My strength arrived quietly, through appointments kept, documents signed, boundaries enforced without apology. When the lawyer called to say the investigation was moving forward, I thanked him and hung up. I stood by the window and watched a pelican skim the water's surface. I felt no triumph. Only relief. I had taken back control, not to punish, but to stop the bleeding. I understood now that love without limits invites harm. Limits are not cruelty. They are clarity. For the first time since my husband died, I felt like my life belonged to me again. Consequences arrived slowly, the way real things do. Not with shouting or spectacle, but with letters, meetings, and silences that stretched longer than anyone expected. The investigation moved through proper channels, indifferent to feelings, attentive only to facts. I was asked to repeat my statement more than once. Each time, I did it calmly, my voice steady, my hands folded. Ethan stopped calling after the lawyer contacted him formally. Brooke tried once more, sending a message that said, "This is spiraling. Please call us." I didn't. I had learned the difference between communication and control. One seeks understanding. The other seeks access. Weeks passed. Then months. Information filtered back in fragments. Ethan had been questioned at work. His employer, a financial services firm, placed him on leave pending review. Brooke's name appeared in emails tied to account changes she couldn't explain. The safety net they joked about had vanished, and suddenly gravity mattered. I felt no satisfaction when I heard this. Only a dull sadness, like watching a bridge collapse after too many cracks were ignored. I thought of the boy Ethan once was, the man he chose to become, and the distance between them that paperwork could not measure. One afternoon, an envelope arrived addressed in Ethan's handwriting. Inside was a single page. "Mom, I'm sorry," it read. "I understand now. I never meant for it to go this far." The words were neat, careful, as if arranged to avoid saying too much. There was no mention of the loan. No mention of the signature. No mention of choice. I folded the letter and placed it in the blue folder. Apologies without accountability are requests, not truths. What he feared was not losing me. It was losing everything else. The house sat empty for a while. When I eventually walked through it with a realtor, the rooms felt hollow, stripped of urgency. Brooke's decorative touches were gone. Ethan's shoes no longer crowded the entryway. The place looked exactly like what it was, a property, not a promise. I sold it quietly. No drama. No announcements. The proceeds went where they should have always gone, into accounts with only my name attached. The numbers looked solid on the page, but more important was what they represented. Safety, reclaimed. Friends from church reached out when they heard pieces of the story. I kept explanations simple. There was a legal issue, I said. It's been resolved. I didn't need witnesses to my pain. I needed peace. Ethan sent one final message months later. "I hope someday we can talk." I read it once and did not respond. Not because I hated him, but because hope requires groundwork, and he had not begun to lay it. Justice doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like balance restored, like weight returned to the right side of the scale. What they lost was not taken by me. It fell away when truth was applied. I slept well that night, knowing consequences had found their proper owners. I chose myself in ways so small they almost felt invisible at first. I rented a modest apartment near the water, not for the view, but for the sound. The ocean has a way of reminding you that life moves forward whether you beg it to or not. The building was quiet. No slammed doors. No whispered conversation stopping when I entered a room. Just my footsteps, my breath, my pace. I bought furniture slowly. A used armchair with firm cushions. A small table that fit exactly where I wanted it. I didn't ask anyone's opinion. That alone felt like a rebellion. I placed Daniel's photo on the shelf by the window, where morning light touched the glass. I lit a candle beside it in the evenings, lavender, the same scent I used years ago when the house felt safe. My mornings became deliberate. I woke early, not from anxiety, but because my body remembered discipline. I made coffee exactly the way I liked it, strong, no sugar, and drank it from the same blue mug I had carried with me from house to house. I sat on the balcony and watched pelicans skim the water, their wings barely touching the surface. Nothing demanded anything from me there. I learned how much energy I had wasted trying to stay welcome. Now, my energy stayed with me. I walked along the shore most days, shoes in hand, sand cool beneath my feet. I felt my balance improve, my thoughts settle. Healing, I realized, was not dramatic. It was repetitive and kind. Twice a week, I volunteered at the local library. I shelved books, helped elderly patrons fill out forms, listened when children told me about stories they loved. No one expected me to fix their lives. They only wanted presence. That suited me fine. When I came home tired, it was the honest kind of tired, earned and clean. There were evenings when loneliness visited. I won't pretend otherwise. I missed the idea of family, even if the reality had wounded me. But loneliness passed more gently than humiliation ever had. I learned the difference. One asks you to reach outward. The other asks you to disappear. I chose the first. I stopped explaining myself. To neighbors. To acquaintances. Even to myself. I didn't need a justification for peace. I had spent decades proving my worth through endurance. Now I let worth exist without proof. Some days, I caught myself smiling for no reason. Other days, I simply breathed and let that be enough. Balance, I discovered, wasn't about perfection. It was about alignment. My life finally faced the same direction as my dignity. For the first time in many years, I wasn't surviving someone else's plan. I was living my own. I am no longer angry. That surprises people when I say it, but anger needs someone to lean against, and I have stepped away. What remains is clarity, steady and warm, like light that doesn't glare. I see my life now without distortion, without the need to excuse what should never have been asked of me. I understand something I didn't before. Love is not proven by how much you endure. It is proven by how safely you are allowed to exist. When that safety disappears, leaving is not failure. It is wisdom arriving late, but still in time. Sometimes I think about Ethan as a boy, the way he used to fall asleep on the couch with his socks half on. I hold that memory gently, without letting it rewrite the truth. We can honor what was without sacrificing what is. If you are listening to this and something feels familiar, let me tell you what I learned the hard way. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to stop explaining. You are allowed to walk away quietly and still be strong. Life has a way of removing people when they refuse to see you clearly. It is not always punishment. Sometimes it is permission. Permission to return to yourself, to live smaller if you need to, but truer. I wake each morning now with a sense of ownership over my hours. My peace no longer hurts. It holds. If this story touched a nerve, you belong here. Stay. Listen. Subscribe to hear truths where silence becomes strength. And remember this, always. Choosing yourself is not the end of love. It is the beginning of dignity.